I'm Sue O'Connell. Tonight on Greater Boston, after years of fighting in Congress and in the courts, 6 years of Trump's tax returns are now public. What have we learned? Will this add to the former president's growing list of legal troubles? Then later, a look at Frontline's latest series digging into Pegasus, the spyware governments around the world have used to monitor dissidents, activists, and journalists, including a couple of people close to murdered Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Donald Trump was the first president in decades to refuse to release his tax returns. And now, after the House wrapped up a lengthy investigation by releasing 6 years' worth of those returns, it's becoming clear why the former president has been fighting so hard to keep them hidden. Take his 2016 and 17 filings, which showed the self-professed billionaire paid just $750 in federal taxes, less than many of us did. And in his final year in office, Trump didn't pay a cent. The returns have also shined a light on how eyebrow-raising foreign bank accounts, loans to his children, and questionable business spending, all of which many tax experts have argued could be evidence of criminal tax evasion. Now, at the same time, according to New York Times reporting, Manhattan's top prosecutor is indicating his office has the grounds to investigate the former president for tax fraud. Of course, if you ask Trump himself, he's the real victim here.
My personal tax returns, which show only that I've had tremendous success. It's so sad for our country. It's nothing but another deranged political witch hunt, which has been going on from the day I came down the escalator in Trump Tower.
I'm joined by Russ Buettner, who's been digging into Donald Trump's taxes and personal finances for the New York Times since 2016 and was one of the 3 reporters at the paper to win a Pulitzer Prize for that work in 2019. And I'm also joined by Julie Weil, who covers taxes for the Washington Post and has been closely following the latest releases. Welcome to both of you. Russ, I want to start with you just for a second. You know, I do this for a living, and I get confused all the time as to which thread I'm following on the Trump investigations. Why were these tax returns released? What lane are we in when we're talking about Trump and these tax returns in Congress?
The lane there is that that Congress was pursuing these as their stated purpose was to see if the mandatory presidential audit program had actually functioned while he was president, and whether any legislative changes were needed for that longstanding policy. So that was the stated purpose that got us here.
And I know by your reporting, Russ, that the language should and would is always tricky when it comes to these mandates, that we're not just like it was a tradition that presidents and candidates release their taxes. It's no law. That's also a bit of a murky area here, but worth looking at why the IRS didn't initiate investigations, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, definitely. This was a policy within the IRS. It had never been required by any law or resulting statute or anything. But I think there was a bill that passed the House at the end of the last session to try to change that. We'll see if that moves forward ever, but you're right, it was not actually required by law.
You know, Julie, every time I hear former President Trump talk about how successful he was, I kind of find it hard to argue with him, since he's clearly done a lot of things and still got elected president and is still not criminally charged in many areas that some people think he should be. Is this, in your opinion, do you think this is representative of the fact that he didn't think he was really going to get elected? Because many people clean up their taxes, some for 10 years, and maybe there's wrongdoing, maybe there's not, maybe there are legal loopholes they take advantage of. But his efforts are right there in the tax returns if you look at them. Do you think he's surprised to this day that he got elected?
I'm not sure that the tax returns really show you what he was thinking in terms of running for office. They show you the way he thought about running businesses and running for office. You know, when he was asked about how minimal his tax burden had been in several recent years, he said, "That makes me smart." It shows his approach. His approach is to report losses wherever he can and minimize the amount of taxes he pays.
So, Russ, of course, the challenge here for the IRS is, with most people who are making lots and lots of money, is you have employees who are up against these battalion of lawyers and accountants who are protecting the filers to make sure that the advice that they probably got from their accountants is directionally correct in terms of IRS guidelines. But there are some things in these tax returns that even myself was shocked to see. One of them was, and to me this almost seems sloppy, can you discuss for us the interest that he claimed from the loans to his kids? And my understanding is that was the same number for 2 years in a row, which is also unlikely. What does it look like, or what are experts and other people saying this looks like he could have been doing?
Well, so I believe what you're talking about is some loans that he made to his kids, and then he was reporting interest income based on that. The obvious thing that points to, since they were employees of his companies at the time, is whether this wasn't really any real business purpose at all, and it wasn't actually a loan, that it was just a way to get around the gift tax, which can be quite onerous compared to the income tax, and then use part of that as like a business expense somehow, or count it as business. But it seems to be a commingling of sort of personal and business funds that, raises eyebrows, and there should be questions raised by the IRS as to why those loans were necessary to his employees, who also happen to be his children.
And Russ, also the foreign income is something that I think most voters would have been interested in knowing during the campaign. Especially, it looks like a large amount of money that Trump received from China or Chinese business. It's uncertain. It's even unclear what that was. Is that a red flag as well?
I mean, it could be. Look, he had a bank account for a long time in China. We reported that as part of our series in 2020. He has business interests all over the world. Pretty much anywhere that he signs a licensing deal, he opens up a bank account. Personally, I think there are much bigger issues that there is just nothing in place to catch, which is that he runs hospitality businesses. And if you wanted to get cash to him, you don't need a bank account in that country. You could rent a block of rooms at one of his hotels, overpay, and then not show up. You've now just given the President of the United States $100,000, $200,000 for nothing in exchange. You could take out 100 memberships at one of his golf clubs and then never have anybody play golf there. That has the patina of a legitimate business expense, but if there's nothing consumed on the other side, it obviously isn't. And there's nothing the IRS is doing that would capture that. And there's nothing in our financial disclosure requirements that would capture that at all. And that's just a huge vulnerability that nobody's really looked at. So,
Julie, to Russ's point, my question to you is, I stopped saying pretty early on, oh, this is it. This is what's going to get him. This is what's going to result in criminal charges, or he won't be elected, or folks won't be supporting him. What's the reaction been to the release of these returns? And I would say also, as shocking as some of the information is, it's not surprising. What are you hearing from people, and also from some of his supporters or critics?
Right. I think there is a lot of interest in these tax returns, simply because he has tried for so long to prevent them from being public, and people want to see what they don't know that is in them. His supporters have heard him say that this is unfair and he should not have been targeted, and that this opens up somehow possible future problems for other people having their tax returns exposed somehow, and are generally inclined to say, well, now that these tax returns were fairly or unfairly exposed, there's not even anything that interesting in them. There's no big bombshell. So what was all this about? His critics are more inclined to say, well, let's keep looking, and which has been true for years now. And I think that when you look at these returns, there's a lot to keep looking for. The returns raise more questions than they answer in some ways. You look at his tax returns and you see page after page after page where he's just deducting other business expenses. I have no idea what those expenses are. If I were an IRS auditor, I'd want to see some receipts. There are a lot of questions raised here. There aren't huge, glaring things that one would say, oh, that's clearly wrong.
Julie, I know here in the Massachusetts area and in Boston there are candidates for local offices who are making it standard procedure to put their tax returns up on their campaign websites, while others still are waiting until they at least get through the primary to do that, if at all. Do you think that we are changing that information that's coming out of this, whether it results in criminal charges or not? Do you think that voters will start demanding candidates be more transparent with their tax histories?
It certainly raised the salience of the issue. I think we were all used to presidential candidates releasing their tax returns sort of as a matter of course, and it wasn't that interesting. And as soon as somebody declines to participate in the custom becomes a source of debate.
Russ, what do you think the next steps are? Again, we talk about how there's certainly data in these returns that could bring the attention of somebody who might think that there's been criminal activity or at least worthy of a criminal investigation. What's the likelihood of that happening?
I'm not sure. It's hard to handicap. I mean, I think he has some exposure from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. They've had this information for a couple of years now. They had a high, very prominent forensic auditing firm going over them. So far, there's been one criminal charge and prosecution. They're related to untaxed benefits to his employees. And there are some audits that are still ongoing. The IRS has an audit that we wrote about dating back to 2009 to a $73 million refund that he got then and has still not been cleared on. And they've rolled more issues into those as that has progressed forward. That could catch up to him. We saw in the report out of the committee a couple of weeks ago that after our article in 2020, the IRS jumped on some of the issues we had raised, including a $21 million deduction he had taken on for some land that he promised not to develop. Those kind of things could have a financial impact. If the IRS decides in any of those that he has committed actual fraud, then it could actually go into possibly the criminal realm. That's a very high kind of bar. But I think the real impact for him in terms of sort of having an effect on him personally is probably more financial. Some of those things with penalties can be quite large. And then there's just the issue whether this will result, as you're talking about, in a change in how we do these things in the future, especially, I think, in auditing these big partnerships. That's just been, I think, just shocking revelations how little scrutiny there was on these massively complex returns.
Well, Russ, that was going to be my next question, too, is that if Trump hadn't run for president if it didn't invite scrutiny because he didn't release his tax returns, if both of you and all of the journalists at your level weren't working on this, certainly we don't have the local journalism in the newspaper world the way we did before when it comes to mayors and governors. It begs the question of how many people on the Trump level of income are just getting away with something that might be beyond legal loopholes. And in the least, the legal loopholes themselves are enough to wonder why an average taxpayer isn't revolting in the streets, no?
It's an excellent point. I mean, you look at this and you think about what most of us are concerned with an audit, right? The IRS is going to show up. Our W-2s are going to have to match what we report exactly. If we have any expenses for a home office or little things, we're going to have receipts and show square footages. He has 500 business entities that file tax returns every year. I've got most of those going back 20 years. The IRS revealed in the course of this investigation with Congress that they had no intention of looking at all 500 of those. They were going to pick isolated incidents on 3 or 4 of those things. And each one of those incidents, to draw their attention, had to be big enough to change his tax status, which generally meant a result of like a $10 or $20 million impact. They weren't at all interested in figuring out whether if we looked at all 500 of these, would there be 50 items that would have that much effect combined? That was not under consideration. They were looking for big pots of money that they could put one, ultimately they raised it to 3 auditors on, to look at a couple of entities and see if that one incident could flip him into a different tax situation. I think that's just stunning that, you know, you have tens of millions of dollars of expenses and of revenue, and no one is really going in to look at those ever. It is an invitation to fraud for these large, complex partnerships.
Yeah, I have a friend who was audited when she was in high school and she was a waitress She made, I think, $10,000 that year, not long ago, and because it was, a cash business, she was audited. And I think about the $10,000 that are probably buried in a number of these millionaires and billionaires' tax returns. Julie, I want to finish with you, and just to the point that the people who would change this are the people who are in Congress, and they seem to be the least likely, have the least appetite to actually make any changes here when it comes to the IRS. There's been a few elected officials in the past who have taken up the mantle, but do you have a prediction that we're actually ever going to make any changes in our tax code that will be more fair, if not at least level the playing field for my friends who are waiters and waitresses versus the multi-billionaires or so-called multi-billionaires?
Right. Well, what happened with Donald Trump is really two different things. There's what happened with Donald Trump when he was a wealthy businessman, and then there's what happened with Donald Trump once he was president. And when he was a wealthy businessman, this was very normal, as Russ is saying, that he would have these enormously complicated tax returns, hundreds of pages, and the IRS simply doesn't have the personnel to really dig into what's happening there, and they're overlooking enormous businesses and business people all over the United States where they just don't investigate. And just this past year, Congress did budget a large amount of money to give the IRS the money to hire more investigators and start looking into those wealthy taxpayers and looking for people who are avoiding taxes.
All right, Russ,
so we'll see what happens there.
We'll see what happens, as former President Trump says. All right, Russ Buettner and Julie Weil, thank you so much for joining us. Happy New Year to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
3 years after journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered by Saudi agents in the country's embassy in Istanbul, new reporting from the Washington Post revealed that some of the people closest to him had been targeted with powerful spyware both before and after his death. And now a new docuseries is digging into the origins of the hacking tool known as Pegasus and the Israeli company NSO that created it and shared it with governments around the world.
This technology is so far ahead of government regulation and even of public understanding of what's happening out there.
All of us suspected that if NSO Group was giving authoritarian and repressive regimes such a powerful instrument of surveillance, that it was pretty likely that this technology would be abused. But none of us had been able to prove it on a systemic scale.
The two-part series is called Global Spyware Scandal, exposing Pegasus, produced by FRONTLINE and Forbidden Films, and it tells the story of the year-long international investigation as it happened. And I'm joined now by one of the film's producers and founder and executive director of Forbidden Films and its parent company, Forbidden Stories, Laurent Richard. Laurent, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I've been following this story for a long time. It's very complicated to try to explain, so I'm hoping you'll help us here. What exactly is Pegasus?
Hi, and thank you for having me. Pegasus is a spyware. It's basically one of the most sophisticated spyware sold by a private company called NSO Group that is based in Israel. And Pegasus is a spyware that is able to take entirely the control of your device, of your phone. I mean, that you can activate your microphone, you can watch what you are watching. It's basically like a person over your shoulder, you know. You can read, or the person can read what you are reading, and Pegasus is about that. So that's about keeping and getting all your secrets and then transferring that to the person, to the intelligence services that are surveilling you, and maybe this information they collect from your device will be used against you at some point. So this is one of the most advanced spyware we know so far. It's considered as a weapon. It's to export that kind of spyware, you need a military license for that.
And the scary part about this, at least to me, is that you don't need to really do anything to be infected by the spyware. Where you don't have to click on a link so much, you don't have to give your consent. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. We call that zero-click infection. Infection, or being infected, or to infect someone, is clearly the language that this industry, the cyber industry, is using when they are talking about targeting someone. So you don't know that you are the target. You don't see anything strange on the device, and you are already trapped. Once you're infected, you're trapped. That means they will know everything about you. And there is no way for you, no mechanism to protect yourself against that kind of weapon.
I want to show a little bit of the film. There was a journalist who was working to expose government corruption. She found out that her phone had been hacked by Pegasus. Let's take a look.
I feel guilty. I feel guilty for the messages I've sent. I feel guilty for the information sources who send me, thinking that some encrypted messaging ways are secure. They did it, and they didn't know that my phone is infected. I mean, my family members are also victimized. The sources are victimized. I'm angry. I'm angry with the government. I'm angry with the companies that produce all these tools and sell it to the bad guys, like Aliyev regime. It's really, it's despicable.
Laurent, the issue here, too, is I understand that tools can be, a hammer can be used for good or a hammer can be used for bad. And this tool was originally designed or marketed that it was going to catch the bad guys. It was going to catch the terrorists. The Israeli company NSO, which is the owner of Pegasus, said that's the only reason they have it is to stop terrorists and bad guys. But what you've discovered in the Frontline docuseries is that it's just not bad guys. It's also journalists, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's the main revelation of the Pegasus project, that with Forbidden Stories we were coordinating with 16 news organizations, including PBS Frontline, that we were revealing for the first time the faces and the victims, the names of the cyber surveillance. And Khadija Ismailova, the journalist, the woman that you just saw in this video, is one of the victims. She's not a terrorist. She's not a criminal. She's just a journalist, maybe one of the very last journalists in Azerbaijan, a dictatorship. And she has been suffering violence for years. She has been jailed. And she's the kind of person fighting for democracy. She was on the list. She was targeted by this spyware. And she was telling us how traumatic it was to know that you were a victim of that. And that's very crucial to understand this, that once you are infected, you become a victim and your life will change. And that is creating a trauma. So this is why officially NSO is always saying that we only say that to catch terrorists and to catch criminals. But what is very concerning is that there is no way to control that. There is no way for citizens to protect themselves. There is no mechanism to sue even NSO or the government who will use that against you.
And I think part of the breakthrough of this in your reporting and the piece is that it's a worldwide issue. Let's take a look at a clip from an anonymous source in Mexico who worked for a government agency that used Pegasus.
No puedo decirles mi nombre. No puedo referir con exactitud la institución en la cual me desempeñé. El procedimiento era tener el número del objetivo. Hacer lo que se denominaba la ingeniería social, que es búsqueda de información en fuentes abiertas del objetivo, con la finalidad de elaborar mensajes de texto que pudieran ser enviados al dispositivo móvil. Si lográbamos el éxito que diera clic en el mensaje, eso automáticamente instalaba el software en el equipo móvil. Y a partir de allí ya podíamos tener acceso al teléfono, toda la información.
So, Laurent, this might be, if you're watching at home, you think, well, this doesn't impact me at all. I'm just someone who, obviously my information is out there. They know where I click. They know where I shop. I walk by a mall. I get a message to come in and get the 5% sale off. Why should regular people care about this?
We all should care about that, because that's clearly a threat against democracies. Because we need to be worried about that, because first, there is nothing to protect us. There is no law, there is no regulation, there is no transparency, there is no accountability. There is no way for you, if you are a victim, to know first that you are a victim, because it's very difficult to find traces of infection. But even if you find traces of infection, there is no way to seek and to get justice from that. So this is really about, it's up to all governments to build some regulation about that, to protect ourselves. But we should be very worried about that, because the business for that kind of for the cyber surveillance industry is a very lucrative and very profitable businesses. You have a lot of tyrants, a lot of dictators who are ready to pay billions or millions to buy that kind of spyware. So there is a lot of businesses to make and a lot of money to make. So no regulation, a lot of money to make. We call that the zero-click era infection. So there is no way for you to know that you're going to be a victim. So this is why it's very concerning. And what we were able to reveal that all the people who were victim of Pegasus, that we were able to confirm that we find some traces of infection, were whether they were lawyers, journalists, human rights activists, or political opponents. All of these people were having something in common. They were fighting for democracies. They were trying to challenge their powers. And because of that, they were on the list. And because of that, they were tracked. And that kind of spyware became, years after year, a kind of magic tool for tyrants, for dictators, and a way for them to export the terror, a way for them to track dissidents who flew abroad very far away, as we were able to prove around the killing of Jamal Khashoggi that the wife and the fiancée of Jamal Khashoggi were both targeted by that kind of spyware. So this can tell you about for what kind of use that spyware or misuse that spyware is used.
Just as we wrap up here, I mean, it sounds like we need some sort of international treaty to ask governments not to use this sort of spyware. Would that be a step to keep track of this problem?
The thing is, I think the question is not about should we have a ban on that kind of spyware, because that spyware can catch some criminals or some terrorists. And if there is a spyware we can prevent some terrorist attack, that's very, very important for the general interest and for all of us, of course. The thing is more about how to control that, how to control the power, who will be in charge of that, who will be in charge to get accountability and transparency. And so far, there is no mechanism, no transparency. And I really think that this is what we are missing today, and this is why we should be very concerned.
Laurent Richard, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on this piece. I learned a lot from it, and I hope everybody watches. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
The series, again, is Global Spyware Scandal, Exposing Pegasus. Part 1 is online now at pbs.org/frontline and in the PBS video app. And Part 2 premieres next Tuesday, January 10th, online and right here on GBH2 at 10 p.m. That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and good night.